So I dwell in possibility, says Dickinson. Emily Dickinson grew up before the Civil War. Her family was part of the Calvinist tradition, but held to the newer, updated Calvinism of the New England Congregationalist families. A little more advanced in their view of religion, but not too much. They were Whiggish in their politics. Now, the political party known as the Whigs stressed social order. In the words of historian Louise Stevenson, Whiggery stood for the triumph of the cosmopolitan and national over the provincial and local, of rational order over irrational spontaneity, of school-based learning over tradition, folkways, and custom, and of self-control over self-expression, end of quote. Now you might remember that Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Whig Party when he was elected to the House of Representatives, but the Whig Party began to splinter over disagreements about how to handle slavery, and in 1856, Lincoln identified with the new Republican Party as he ran for the Senate and lost, but soon would be elected president. Now there was a revival meeting in Emily Dickinson's town in 1850, and many young people were converted, saved, and she said she saw the peace on their faces. But she was stubborn. She refused to take part in the revival meetings. As we would say today, it just wasn't her thing. She felt a deep desire in her heart for spiritual sustenance, but the churchy form of faith was not what she chose. Instead of living in the house of creeds, she chose to dwell in the house of possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows and superior for doors. Emily Dickinson chose to dwell in poetry rather than in prose. She chose possibility over the Whiggish tradition of order and custom and coloring inside the lines. Her spirituality took on a new form of poetry with little dashes everywhere, the short stabbing lines of enigmatic phrases not always clear to the reader, but packed full of meaning. She became a doubting believer, or a believing doubter. She chose to dwell in possibility. Now, in today's reading from Matthew 14, Jesus invites us to dwell in possibility. There are 5,000 people, not counting women and children. And there's another sermon right there that I won't go into. Commentators on this passage guess that when we add the women and children to the statistic, there was probably 10,000 people in that crowd. Now stop and think about that number, 10,000 people. That's more than we have in church on Sunday. Have you ever been to a gathering of 10,000 people, maybe a rock concert, or a political convention, or some kind of a protest? I know it's nothing compared to Bryant-Denny Stadium, but it's a lot of people, 10,000 people. You must have had a strong voice to teach all those people. Now someone, I don't know, we don't know if it was Andrew or John or Nathaniel or Judas or who it was, but some disciple came to Jesus suggesting that, and they were concerned for the people, suggesting they send them away into the villages to get something to eat and then come back together. The disciples didn't want hundreds of people fainting because of hunger or low blood sugar. They were concerned, and that's when Jesus shocked them. This is the most shocking verse in this passage. Jesus turns to them and says, you give them something to eat. And when I read through this passage and I come to that, I sort of have to go back. You give them something to eat. I mean, can you imagine standing there close to Jesus, being there, seeing him turn toward you and point his finger at you and say, you fix the problem. You solve the crisis. You find a vaccine for COVID-19. You dismantle the systemic racism in America. You feed the poor. You build the church back up. You get young people interested in Christianity. You give health care to everyone. You get people to love one another. You. You just have to put your hands up and say, I'm sorry, Jesus, I don't have enough food to feed all those people. And Jesus says, well, where do you live? And you point over there and you say, that's my house over there. Jesus says, oh, I see. You live in the house of pros. You got to move down the street and live in a house of possibility. I'll tell you what you do, he says. Find out what you have to work with. Go out and search among the crowd. See what food you can find. Do an inventory of resources, and then come back and bring what you've got to me. So the disciples do that. They find only 5 loaves of bread and 2 pieces of salted fish, and they present them to Jesus. Now, what happens next seems a little bit magical. It's like those magicians you see on TV or at a show who seem to just reach in their hat and pull out a rabbit. And we all say, how did he do that? Elisha fed 100 people with 20 loaves of bread. Now, that's doable. That's 20 loaves for 100 people. You can give each group of 5 people a loaf of bread. And 5 people, 1 loaf of bread, they get a handful. That's doable. But 10,000 people and 5 loaves, well, that's 1 loaf of bread for every 2,000 people. Each person might get a little tiny crumb, if that. So how did he do it? Was Jesus a magician? Did he swing out from behind him a black hat and pull out a loaf and give it to one disciple and pull out another loaf and give it to another disciple? Did he open up his coat and pull out a loaf and give it to Andrew and another loaf to John? How did he do that? When George Floyd was murdered by a police officer and everyone saw the video, it really couldn't be denied. Immediately, a few people in his neighborhood went to the streets in protest. They were joined by others from all over town. And then people from other cities took to the street in protest of such cruel injustice. And then people in cities all across Europe and Asia and all across the world began to fill the streets in a global protest. And how did that happen? Can you explain it? Well, I think we can. Maybe we can. The spirit of the prophet Amos and the prophet Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah were in the bones of those good people. And suddenly the ankle bone connected to the leg bone and the leg bone connected to the hip bone, and it got to moving and a movement sprang to life. The spirit of the prophets and the spirit of Jesus swept through the world, and the voice from the burning bush was heard throughout the land. Let my people go. Now we know that people are dying at a scary rate from a tiny little virus. There is is no vaccine yet. Or scientists and researchers from UAB and institutions all over the world are hard at work to find the right combination of little pieces of God's creation to put together to make the medicine to stop the pandemic. I mean, God has given us the answer. It's there somewhere in nature. All of our medicines come from nature or combining things from nature. It's there. God has given it to us. It's up to us to find it and save thousands and thousands and millions of people. And it will happen. We have to be patient, but it will happen. And people will be saved from death because scientists who dwell in the house of possibility have put their fingers on the gift God has left us to discover. You know, when we live in the house of pros, we keep telling ourselves, it can't be done. No way. But when we dwell in possibility, we have more windows to look through. We have more doors to open. We are able to gaze up in the vast sky and see possibilities. Followers of Jesus do not dwell in prose. We look around to discover our resources. We don't overlook anything, even if it's small. And then we take what we have and we offer it to Jesus. We give up the creative power to the Holy Spirit. And then Jesus gives it back to us. Jesus blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to us, and magical things happen. People are fed. Children are healed. Women are seen as equal. Skin color is made relative. The one human race is recognized for what it is. Hatred is converted to love and respect. Privilege is recognized and renounced. Like the disciples, we look around and say, we don't have enough. There's not enough. And sometimes we look within ourselves and we say, I am not enough. Because somebody's told us we're not enough. And we believed it. But Jesus says, bring me yourself. Offer yourself up to me, and I will give yourself back to you, and you will know deep in your heart that you are enough. And you don't have to put yourself down anymore. So Emily said, I dwell in possibility. A fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. And the last two lines of that short poem say, the spreading wide my narrow hands, together paradise. Paradise is all around us. Heaven can be seen if we look through the right windows. If we take our narrow hands, not narrow minds, and we spread them wide, being broad-minded, we can scoop up some of heaven for ourselves. Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke the bread, he gave it to them to distribute. They ate the Lord's Supper, all were filled, all were satisfied, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers. You know what you do with leftovers. One basket for each of the 12 apostles to take home, put in the microwave. And the apostles' families had fish sandwiches for about a week.